I'm Teresa Caraggio, and this is Third Paradigm, where I say yes and to Russell Brand's Under the Skin podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking about number 202, The Moral Conundrums of Politics, with Tim Pool. And I'll be saying yes to Tim's perspective on critical race theory. I'll be saying a respectful disagreement on his idea of the efficacy of Occupy Wall Street, and I'll be bringing in a different perspective on secession from my book, How to Dismantle an Empire. So, first, I want to talk about an unusual correspondence that I found with Tim, which is where he lives now. When he says he lives in the middle of nowhere, he's in the middle of my nowhere, the nowhere that I was born. I've always described myself as being born on the border of West Virginia and Maryland that juts out into the middle of nowhere. And that is where his new home is also. So I want to look at Appalachia, a place that I always thought of myself as having escaped and felt kind of a survivor's guilt about having gotten away from there. Over the last 6 years, I've been developing an adult relationship with the place where I was born, primarily because my parents had been in decline, and I took over the house that I grew up in, and I've been redoing it and transforming it and making it into something that would not become part of the slumlord ghettification that has been happening in my hometown. So there is a lot to be said about Appalachia, and the reason that I'm calling this episode Whites Trashed is that I think we need to look at how that has been done to whites, that it is a reputation that's been developed of rednecks, of hillbillies, that is part of the demonization and the way of taking people and turning them into disposable people. One book that really does a great job talking about this is What You Are Getting Wrong About Appalachia. And this answers J.D. Vance's hillbilly elegy. I hear that J.D. Vance is probably going to run for president in the next election, and so I think it's really important to look at what he's getting wrong. Another book that is so funny and really very pointed is Deer Hunting with Jesus, Dispatches from America's Class War. And this is Joe Bagent, who is since deceased, and it is one that everyone should read just for the sheer pleasure of it, and also to understand what is really happening with America's working class. And another really good book is White Trash, the 400-year history, untold history of class in America. But the one that really zeroes in on Appalachia and tells the history of it, the deep context of it, is called Ramp Hollow, The Ordeal of Appalachia, and this is Stephen Stoll. So in Ramp Hollow, what he talks about is how the subsistence farmer ended up becoming dispossessed, how there was a campaign by corporations in order to get people off their land and to look at development as something that would be happening in the cities, that no one would want to stay in the country. I know Jonathan Haidt, when he interviewed with Russell, he mentions that he came from a farm in West Virginia and that he would never want to go back there. Other people who did go back there are, for instance, Barbara Kingsolver, whose husband had a farm in West Virginia. And so when she does her book, Animal Vegetable Miracle, she goes and lives for a year where they buy nothing. They're allowed one thing that they can get that isn't in season or locally produced. And so otherwise they live off of that over the course of the year. So this is a way of life, that there were hollows throughout Appalachia and people lived very decent lives. So I look at all war, as I said in other episodes, as only one that is always empire against sovereignty. So at some point, Tim talks about civil wars, and he talks about, among others, the Spanish Civil War, since he's looking at whether civil war is something that is going to erupt or is already erupting in the U.S. Another book is called Strangers in Their Own Land, which is about the Trump country and how Appalachia became Trump country. And Arlie Russell Hochschild is the wife of Adam Hochschild, who has written the most brilliant book on the Spanish Civil War, and I'm forgetting the name right now, but it's one of the best books I've ever read. And it talks about how it really, I don't think that there's ever a civil war. Civil war is always one side being on the side of empire. And Franco was certainly on the side of empire. And the Republic, which was the government, was on the side of sovereignty. So you can't look at that and say, oh, this was just a Spanish Civil War. This was a war of empire and sovereignty. And I think personally that that's still going on in Spain now. And I am for sovereignty. At some point, Tim talks about the Balkanization of the U.S. Balkanization is kind of a rhetorical trick because it's a word that includes a value judgment within it. And I don't know the history of the Balkans, but I certainly know that that is meant to be a bad thing. Another country we could be looking at is Switzerland. Switzerland is all little individual cantons, and I talk about it in my book when I quote Johann Galtung, who is the founder of Peace and Conflict Studies. He was brought in to negotiate over Afghanistan, and this is a long time ago, and he said he always looks at, what do I compare this to? And the country that he compares it to is Afghanistan. That Afghanistan, the reason that it was considered the graveyard of empires is because it had all tiny individual areas that were self-governing for the most part. And so you couldn't come in and just conquer the whole and then have it be given up. You had to conquer each one individually. So that Balkanization is something that we should maybe be considering. However, I don't think that critical race theory is the way to do that. And what I look at with that is the efficacy of white guilt. One of my rules of thumb is that guilt makes people behave badly because it puts them in a position of then projecting blame, saying, okay, well, I may be bad, but they're worse than me. I may be someone who is racist. You know, we're all racist, but they're more racist than I am. I don't think that's going to get us to a place of unity where we can come to any kind of agreement. So what is going to get us to that place where we can develop and look at new systems? Occupy Wall Street was a very interesting and I think revolutionary event. David Graeber, who is the primary influence on my book, was the one who was credited with coining the phrase, the 1%. And so the 1% was really brilliant because we don't have a term for the people who are at the top. We don't have a way of describing them in a way that is self-explanatory. At the beginning of the country, you could talk about the financiers, who were the ones who raped Appalachia, or you could talk about the merchant bankers. But now we don't have a phrase for that. The 1% I don't think is descriptive enough, because it's not 1 in 100. Really, the people we're talking about is 1 in 100 million. Those are the bankers. Those are the ones who are really pulling the strings. So looking at, though, the fact that we want to target the economic systems, how do we come to any kind of unity about that? I think that Tim has done a disservice to Occupy Wall Street by presenting himself as someone who can tell anecdotes, and that those tell the truth about whether Occupy Wall Street was hypocritical. The word anarchy means rule by rules, not by rulers. It comes from the Greek, and the Greek revolt against the archons. And so what they had from David Graeber at Occupy Wall Street was a beautiful system of horizontal structures, like the Zapatistas, that they had rules, and there were rules for who could speak, that otherwise what you end up with is chaos. And I've seen that take down so many different organizations that I've been part of that were being effective, to the degree that I even wonder whether it is a technique that's part of a playbook. One of those was I started my radio station 10 years ago on the Pirate Station in Santa Cruz. And they were an anarchist organization who would, really, again, brilliant concept. They would do a podcast radio, so that it was just people in a basement who would then feed into the web. But then they planted an antenna on the highest tree they could find, and that's what would broadcast it. So there was a separation between the people who were producing the content and the actual broadcasting, which is what protected it from getting taken down for a very long time. But what took it down was really internal, was having people say, the purpose of this is not to give independent news to all the public that is hungry for it, that's supporting the radio. No, our purpose is to give an equal voice to whoever is underrepresented. And so if we have Iraq veterans against the war who want to get on in the middle of the day and curse a blue streak so that it can't be broadcast anywhere in public, then we need to do that. If we have Latinos who we feel are not represented, we need to broadcast Spanish language in the middle of drive time. So it ended up defeating the purpose of bringing the news, and eventually shut the entire thing down, because there weren't supporters for let's just give a voice to anyone who we think, should be able to speak. Instead, you need to have a purpose that you're unified around, and not care about the color or race of anyone who shares that purpose. So when we look at how to fix things, what the real problem is, I think the problem does come down to economics, which is what I write about entirely in my book. I think that race has been something that divides us, that keeps us from working together and being unified on the problems. But if you're not looking at economics as being the problem, then you are going back to, well, these are my solutions, these are my people, and not really looking at what people are needing in order to govern themselves. One of the reasons that Tim says that he doesn't think that self-governance would work without a centralized authority is that people would have racist policies, that they could then enact segregation and discrimination the way that he says he was when his family was growing up in a family that had a Korean grandmother, I believe. Now, growing up in Cumberland, I remember at 4 years old counting my street and that it was exactly 50-50 black and white. These days, there's a lot of households on my street that are 50-50 black and white. In Cumberland, we don't make a big deal out of that. You are going to the same schools. You are part of the same sports teams. You are living in the same neighborhoods, in the same communities, and often in the same families. And so there's not a virtue that's really seen as being associated with that the way that there is in my home in California. And so he now has this $1 million compound in the mountains, and he sees himself as being a part of that area. Now, there's no one around my hometown who is getting the capital together by doing jobs that serve the community to build $1 million homes. These are things that are built by people who come from DC because it's considered kind of close enough to be, in a way, kind of the Vegas, what happens there stays there. And if Tim lives where I suspect he does, one of the most disturbing stories I ever heard was a woman around my age who gave testimony to Congress about having been groomed to be a child sex slave so that she would entrap politicians and diplomats and they would be able to blackmail them with footage. And so I think about that same area where I would be on summer vacations playing Uno with my grandmother, playing shuffleboard with my brothers, and at that same time that there would be this girl my age who is being groomed as a sex slave. And that has been one of the most disturbing things that I have ever heard. And so in this area, there is a lot of things that happen in order to keep the economic system corrupt and to keep this happening. And I think that that's what we need to secede from. We need to secede from the real government. The real government are that 1 in 100 million who are making up the rules for the rest of us to live by. And I don't think that seceding from the puppet government really is going to make a difference. We need to own our own economies, and we need to be able to start producing, to go back to being those subsistence farmers and to be serving each other in the community and not depending on government or corporations in order to make our lives possible. Thank you, and I really appreciated Tim's conversation and really enjoyed it. If you're intrigued and would like to go deeper into these ideas, here's another video on a related theme. And if you'd like to delve into this entire area, here's a playlist. Thank you, and I would love it if you would subscribe.